The morning my parents woke me with ice-cold water and threw me out on my 18th birthday, I never imagined the secret they had buried alive for 12 long years. The water hit my face like a slap made of ice. I woke up gasping, sheets soaked, my mother standing over the bed with an empty pitcher in her hand. "Time to man up," she said, like she was reading a grocery list. My stepfather Victor stood in the doorway. 2 duffel bags sat by his feet. My duffel bags, already packed, already zipped. "I'm your son," I said. Water dripped off my chin onto the mattress. My mother laughed, short and flat. "You've been a burden since your father died. Therapy, nightmares, all that money we wasted on you." She said it the way you'd complain about a car that never stopped needing repairs. Victor nodded along like he was confirming a number on a spreadsheet. "We fed you for 18 years, Ethan. That's more than most people would do." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not yet. Some part of me had given up on this house a long time before that morning. I pulled on the jeans from the floor, grabbed the 2 bags, and walked past both of them into a Tuesday that didn't feel like my birthday at all. They didn't say goodbye. My mother had already turned back toward the kitchen before I reached the door. Victor watched me go the way you'd watch a delivery truck pull out of a driveway, checking a task off a list. By 9 that night, I was sitting under fluorescent light at a shelter downtown, filling out an intake form with a pen that kept skipping. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, not from cold, from something else. My phone buzzed on the plastic table. My mother had unblocked me just long enough to type 1 sentence. "Stop calling family saying you're homeless. You're embarrassing us." Then a second message from Victor. "At least your real dad had the decency to die overseas." I put the phone face down and put my head in my hands. That was the moment I broke. Right there in a shelter intake room in a plastic chair bolted to the floor, 18 years and 6 hours old. A woman named Rosa knelt down next to my chair. She had tired eyes and a lanyard with too many keys on it. "What's wrong?" she asked, and I just showed her the screen. Her eyes moved from the messages to the intake form, still sitting half-finished on the table. She went still in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Your father died overseas?" she asked, slow, like she was choosing each word from a box. "When I was 6, I said. "Army. I don't remember much, just the funeral." "Did you see a body?" she asked. "Did you go to a burial?" I stared at her. What kind of question is that? She didn't answer. Her fingers were already moving across a keyboard at the desk behind her. Fast, purposeful. 30 seconds later, her face had gone the color of the tile floor. "Ethan," she said, "your father didn't die overseas. He's alive. He's been in a psychiatric care facility for 12 years. The room tilted sideways. I remember gripping the edge of the table to keep from sliding out of the chair. "We had a funeral," I said. My voice didn't sound like mine. "I went to grief counseling for 2 years because of it." Rosa looked at me the way you look at someone standing near a ledge. "You need to see him today," she said, "before anyone in your family finds out that you know." That sentence rearranged 12 years of my life in about 4 seconds. I grew up in a 2-story house on Larkspur Avenue in Dayton, Ohio, the kind of street with identical mailboxes and a homeowners association that cared more about lawn height than anything happening behind closed doors. My mother, Diane, remarried when I was 7, 13 months after what I thought was my father's funeral. Victor moved in with a leather recliner and a set of golf clubs and very quickly made it clear whose house it actually was. I was 6 when they told me my father, Daniel Reyes, had died in a training accident overseas. I remember a folded flag. I remember a photograph on an easel at the front of a small room that smelled like carpet cleaner. I remember my mother crying in a way I'd never seen her cry before or since, and at 6 years old I filed that away as proof. Grief that real couldn't be performance. I didn't have the vocabulary yet to understand that grief and guilt can look identical from across a room. There was no body at that funeral. I know that now. At the time, nobody explains that detail to a 6-year-old, and nobody expects the 6-year-old to ask. For the first 2 years after, my mother was almost gentle with me, in the distracted way of someone managing a problem rather than raising a child. Then Victor arrived, and gentleness became inefficient. He had 2 grown daughters from a previous marriage who visited on holidays and looked at me like a line item that hadn't been in the original budget. My mother started describing my nightmares, my bedwetting, my 2 years of grief therapy at Miller & Associates on Wayne Avenue as expenses rather than symptoms. "Do you know what all that cost us?" became a sentence I heard more times before I turned 10 than I heard "I love you" in my whole childhood. There was an incident when I was 11 that I didn't understand until years later. My mother came home one afternoon from what she said was a dentist appointment, and I noticed a visitor badge still clipped to her purse strap. It said Weston Behavioral Health Center. I asked her about it at dinner, innocently, the way kids ask about things. She snatched the badge off before Victor even looked up and told me the dentist's office was in the same building complex. I believed her. Why wouldn't I have? Looking back now, that was the year my father's discharge paperwork first came up for review, according to records I'd later get from the VA. My mother had gone to sign something. I just didn't know what yet. There was another moment, smaller, that I didn't think about for years until it came roaring back the night Rosa told me the truth. When I was 9, a piece of mail arrived at the house addressed to a Daniel Reyes, no return address, postmarked from a city I didn't recognize. My mother snatched it off the counter so fast the corner of the envelope tore in her hand. "Wrong address," she said, already walking it out to the recycling bin at the curb, not even waiting for trash day. I remember asking why someone would mail something to a dead man's name at our house, and she told me it happened sometimes. Old accounts, old mailing lists that never got updated. I was 9. I believed her the way 9-year-olds believe anything said with enough confidence. Looking back, that was almost certainly one of my father's 41 letters, caught before it ever reached me. One small, quiet theft buried inside 100 larger ones. Money was always a specific kind of tense in our house. Private tense, the kind that lived behind closed bedroom doors and hissed arguments that stopped the second I walked into a room. Victor drove a new truck every 3 years. My mother took 2 vacations a year to places like Sanibel Island and once, memorably, Cabo San Lucas, without me, staying with Victor's sister those weeks. And yet every school fundraiser, every registration fee, every pair of shoes I outgrew came with a sigh and a comment about how tight things were. I didn't understand the math then. There was a college fund, opened under my name when I was 6, that my mother told me was mostly gone by the time I was 16, eaten up by the therapy bills and the cost of raising me. I believed that too, because I had no reason yet to disbelieve anything she told me. The relationship, if you could call it that, cooled steadily every year after Victor moved in. By the time I was 15, we were coexisting more than living together. I ate dinner standing at the counter most nights, so I wouldn't have to sit across from either of them. My mother kept a running tally of things she'd sacrificed for me, recited at random, usually right before asking me to do something for her. Victor never hit me. I want to be clear about that, because people assume the worst kind of story when they hear kicked out at 18. It wasn't that kind of house. It was colder than that. It was a house that made you feel like a subscription service somebody forgot to cancel. My 18th birthday fell on a Tuesday. I'd known for about 6 months, from comments dropped at dinner, that they were counting down to it. "Once he's 18 was a phrase I heard more than once, said like the deadline on a lease. I told myself I was imagining the coldness in it. I wasn't. Rosa drove me herself, in her own car, a gray Corolla with a rosary hanging from the mirror. Neither of us said much on the way. I remember watching the strip malls go by and thinking that 12 years of my life had just become a lie I hadn't finished reading yet. The facility was called Weston Behavioral Health Center, the same name from the badge on my mother's purse strap 7 years earlier. I didn't put that together until later that night, lying awake, replaying every detail. At the time, I just followed Rosa through a set of double doors that smelled like floor wax and something sharper underneath it. Antiseptic, maybe, or fear. A nurse walked us down a hallway with names printed on little placards outside each door. I stopped breathing somewhere around the third one. Reyes, D. He was sitting by a window when I walked in a gray cardigan 2 sizes too big for him, and for a second, neither of us moved. "Ethan?" His voice cracked on the second syllable. His face did something I'd never seen an adult's face do. Folded in on itself all at once, like a building coming down. "They told me you hated me, that you chose them, that you didn't want to see me anymore. They told me you were dead," I said. My own voice barely worked. "They told me you died a hero. I gave a eulogy at your funeral when I was 6 years old." He put both hands over his face. His shoulders shook. I stood there in the doorway of a room I didn't know existed 20 minutes earlier and watched my father cry for the first time in my life. A nurse named Priya explained it to me in the hallway. While my father composed himself, he'd been cleared for discharge for almost 4 years. Stable, medicated, no danger to himself or others, fully capable of independent living with light support. But discharge required a family member or listed guardian to sign off and arrange release, and no one had ever come. Not once. Not a visit, not a phone call, not a signature. "I'll take him," I said before she'd even finished the sentence. "Whatever I need to sign, I'll sign it." Priya looked at me carefully. "You just turned 18 today?" "About 14 hours ago," I said. She almost smiled. "Then you're exactly who this paperwork has been waiting for." While she went to pull his file, my phone buzzed in my pocket. A banking alert. I opened it standing right there in that hallway and felt the floor drop out from under me a second time in one day. My mother had drained my college savings account, all of it, $11,400, wired out in a single transfer that morning, the same morning she'd poured ice water on my face and called me a burden. My father read the notification over my shoulder before I could stop him. His jaw tightened in a way that made him look, for just a second, like a soldier again instead of a patient. "That account," he said quietly, "was never just college savings. That was combat pay, survivor benefit allotments. Every month for 12 years automatic deposit meant for you." I signed the original paperwork myself before I shipped out the last time. I never saw a cent of it. I didn't even know the account still existed. I sat down hard in a plastic chair in that hallway, the second plastic chair of my life that day that had watched me fall apart. We didn't sleep much that first night. My father, whose name I'd been told for 12 years belonged to a dead man, sat across from me at a motel just off Route 4 that smelled like old cigarettes and carpet cleaner, and we started, piece by piece, to reconstruct what had actually happened to us. The next morning, we drove to Larkspur Avenue together. In a rental car my father insisted on paying for, even though I offered. We didn't call ahead. Victor answered the door in his bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, and his face did something I'll I'll remember for the rest of my life. It didn't just fall, it emptied out. My mother appeared behind him a second later, and the mug she was holding slipped straight out of her hand and shattered against the tile. Neither of them said a word for what felt like a full minute. My father broke the silence first, and he did it calmly, almost gently, in a tone that made the whole moment feel more dangerous than shouting would have. "Hello, Diane," he said. "We need to talk about the death benefits you've been collecting for the last 12 years. Victor recovered fastest, the way people who are used to controlling rooms always do. "This is private property," he snapped. "You need to leave, both of you, or I'm calling the police." "Go ahead," my father said. "I'd like them here too." My mother's whole demeanor shifted in real time, right in front of me, like watching someone change costumes between scenes. The panic drained out of her face and something softer slid in behind it. "Daniel," she said, voice suddenly thick with concern. "Are you taking your medication? You know how confused you get. This isn't good for you, showing up like this, upsetting yourself." It was such a smooth pivot that for a half second I almost believed her myself, and I'd watched her drain my bank account 18 hours earlier. "I'm not confused," my father said. "I know exactly what today is. It's my son's 19th hour as an adult, and it's the first day in 12 years that anyone has told him the truth." Victor lunged, not at my father, at my phone, which I'd already pulled out and angled low against my hip, recording. My father stepped between us fast enough that I didn't think a man his size, thin from 12 years of institutional meals, could move. His hands were shaking. He held his ground anyway. We left before it turned into something worse than shouting, but I had it all, every second, on tape. That night, back at the motel, I spread everything out across the little desk under the window. My father's discharge summary, my birth certificate, screenshots of the texts from my mother and Victor, the banking alert. I made 3 phone calls before midnight. The bank's fraud department, the local police non-emergency line to file a report. A number Rosa had given me for a legal aid clinic downtown that specialized in exactly this kind of case: elder and disability financial exploitation. The intake attorney's name was Marcus Alvarez. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting once, which I'd later learn was rare for him. When I finished, he was quiet for a second. "Ethan," he said, "I want you to understand something. What you're describing isn't a family disagreement. It's fraud. Federal fraud if the VA benefits were involved, plus state charges for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. This is a case, a real one. I'm going to need documents." A week later, the documents started arriving faster than I could read them. The funeral home on Wayne Avenue confirmed in writing, at Alvarez's request, that no body, no casket, and no cremation had ever been processed under my father's name. Just a rented chapel room for 90 minutes and a guest book with 41 signatures in it. My mother had staged an entire funeral, obituary and all, for a man who was breathing comfortably 20 minutes away the whole time. Then the bank called back with something that changed the shape of everything. There was a power of attorney on file, dated 11 months after my father's hospitalization, granting my mother full financial control over his benefits and accounts. It carried his signature. Alvarez pulled an old signature sample from my father's military discharge file and set it beside the power of attorney. They didn't match, not close. The one on the power of attorney was shaky in places it shouldn't have been shaky, and confident in places a distressed, newly hospitalized man's hand never would have been. Alvarez said the word forgery so plainly, it didn't even sound dramatic. It just sounded like a fact sitting there on the table between us. That single sheet of paper was the loose thread. I didn't know it yet, but pulling on it was about to unravel every story I'd ever been told about my own life. Alvarez filed a report with Adult Protective Services the same afternoon he compared the signatures. Within 3 days, an APS investigator named Grace Whitfield had opened a formal case and requested her own copy of everything: the power of attorney, the funeral home records, the banking history going back 12 years. She was methodical in a way that made me trust her almost immediately. She didn't promise me anything. She just wrote everything down and told me the process would be slow, and I needed to be patient with it. The VA scheduled its own interview separately, a required step whenever a beneficiary's competency and preferences needed to be re-established after this kind of red flag. My father sat across from a caseworker in a small beige office and answered every question calmly. Who did he want managing his benefits going forward? Who did he trust? Whether anyone had pressured him, threatened him, or told him what to say, he didn't hesitate on any of it. When they asked who he wanted as his designated representative, he said my name before the caseworker had even finished writing the question down. "Ethan Reyes," he said, "my son. Nobody pressured me. I've been waiting 12 years to say his name to someone who was listening." I sat in the waiting room during that interview and cried in a way I hadn't let myself cry since I was 6 years old at a funeral for a man who wasn't in the casket. My mother, meanwhile, was not sitting still. 2 days after the APS case opened, she called me 11 times in a row. I didn't answer any of them. On the 12th call, she left a voicemail, and her voice had changed completely from the woman who threw ice water on my face. It was soft now, almost pleading. "Ethan, baby, I know this looks bad, but you don't understand the position I was in. I was drowning. I did what I had to do to keep this family together. Please just call me back. We can fix this as a family without lawyers." I saved that voicemail. Alvarez told me to save save every single one. Victor took a different approach. 3 nights after the confrontation at the house, his truck showed up outside the motel where my father and I were staying. I saw it from the window first, parked across the lot under a broken security light, engine off, headlights off, Victor's silhouette visible behind the wheel. He didn't get out. He didn't knock. He just sat there for almost 40 minutes, watching our room. I called the non-emergency police line before he'd even had a chance to notice the curtain move. An officer arrived within 15 minutes and ran the plate. Victor told them he was just driving around, couldn't sleep, ended up near an old friend's place. The officer didn't buy it, and neither did I, but there wasn't enough for an arrest, just a report and a warning to stay away from the property. Alvarez used that report 2 days later to file for a temporary protective order on my father's behalf, citing the intimidation as part of the broader pattern of financial exploitation. A judge granted it without a hearing, on an emergency basis, the same week. 2 days after the protective order was granted, my mother tried a different tactic entirely. She had Feldman, her attorney, reach out to Alvarez with an offer, a lump sum, $35,000, wired directly to me, no admission of wrongdoing required, in exchange for dropping any further pursuit of the APS case and agreeing not to cooperate with any criminal investigation that might follow. Alvarez relayed the offer to me flatly, without any push in either direction, the way a good lawyer is supposed to. I sat with it for exactly 1 night. $35,000 would have covered tuition, a car, a real start. Part of me, the part that had spent 18 years being told I was expensive and unwanted, wanted to take it just to finally feel like the ledger had balanced in my favor for once. But sitting across from my father at the motel that night, watching him carefully count out exact change for a vending machine because he hadn't handled real cash in over a decade, I understood what the offer actually was. It wasn't restitution. It was a price tag on my silence, calculated to be just large enough to tempt an 18-year-old who'd never had money, and just small enough that it barely dented what she'd actually stolen. I told Alvarez to decline it the next morning. Good, he said, and I could hear something like relief in his voice. That offer would have made the fraud case almost impossible to pursue. She knew that too. My mother's sister, my Aunt Karen, called me once during all of this, and it was the strangest conversation of the entire ordeal. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask about my father. She asked, almost too casually, whether I'd given any documents to a lawyer yet, and whether those documents included any paperwork with notary stamps on it. I told her I didn't know what she meant. She changed the subject fast, and hung up not long after. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had too many other fires to watch. I moved my father into a small furnished apartment near the VA clinic that week, using an emergency housing voucher Rosa helped us find. It wasn't much. 1 bedroom, a kitchenette, a window unit that rattled all night, but it was his, signed under his own name for the first time in 12 years. He cried again when we carried the last box in. I was starting to understand that this was just who he was now, a man who cried easily because he'd spent 12 years in a place where nobody let him feel anything at all. 3 days after we moved him in, Alvarez called me with the update that changed the entire shape of the case. I need you to sit down for this one, he said, and I remember the sound of my own pulse in my ears while I waited for him to keep talking. Before he told me, I need to back up 2 days, because something else had happened that I hadn't fully understood the size of yet. My mother had started working the family, the way she always did when she felt cornered. She called my grandmother, her own mother, and told a version of events where I had abandoned Daniel's care to strangers for years, and was now trying to punish her for grief decisions made during the worst period of her life. She called my cousin Danielle, who I'd been close with as a kid, and asked her to talk some sense into me before I destroyed the family over old paperwork. She even reached out to my childhood best friend's mother, someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, hoping the message would filter back to me secondhand and soften me up. It almost worked, a little. My grandmother called me confused and hurt, repeating my mother's version back to me almost word for word, and I had to sit on the phone for 40 minutes explaining, calmly, that there had never been a real funeral, that my father had been alive and institutionalized this entire time, that $11,400 of my own account had vanished the same morning I was thrown out onto the street. I could hear the silence on the other end shift as she processed it. She told me he died in the field, my grandmother said quietly. She cried for a week. She's been telling that story for 12 years, I said. I don't think crying makes it true. My grandmother didn't call my mother's side again after that. That was the first crack in the family that wasn't mine, and it mattered more than I expected it to. Victor, for his part, tried a version of the same play with people from his side. He told his daughters I was an ungrateful kid stirring up trouble to get money, conveniently leaving out the part where the money in question had been stolen from a miner's account the same day that miner was left on a curb. One of his daughters, Melissa, actually reached out to me directly, not to attack me, but to ask carefully whether it was true. I sent her the banking alert screenshot with the timestamp still visible. She didn't respond to me again for almost 2 weeks, and when she finally did, it wasn't to defend her father. Every one of these moves followed the same pattern, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. My mother and Victor weren't trying to fix anything. They were trying to control who believed what, fast, before the paperwork could speak for itself. They played the victim to any anyone who hadn't seen the evidence yet, and they played offense to anyone who had. It was exhausting to watch, and it was even more exhausting to be the target of it, while also trying to help my father learn how to use a debit card again after 12 years of having every decision made for him by an institution. So when Alvarez called and told me to sit down, I already had a low, cold feeling that whatever came next was going to matter more than anything else in the case so far. The bank's fraud team finished tracing the forged power of attorney, he said. Every notarized document like that has to be logged. Stamp number, date, notary's license ID. It took them a while because the stamp was smudged in the scan, but they finally pulled a clean copy from the original filing at the county clerk's office. And, I said, because he'd gone quiet in a way that felt deliberate. The notary on record isn't a stranger, Ethan, he said. It's your mother's sister. It's your Aunt Karen. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just sat there in my father's new kitchenette, listening to the window unit rattle, replaying my aunt's strange phone call from days earlier, the one where she'd asked, too casually, whether I'd handed over any paperwork with notary stamps on it. She hadn't been making conversation. She'd been checking how much rope she still had left. I thought about every holiday dinner, every birthday card signed in Karen's looping handwriting, every ordinary Sunday phone call between two sisters that I'd never once questioned, because why would I have? Are you sure, I said, finally, that it's not a clerical thing? A mix-up? Notary logs don't mix up, Alvarez said gently. There's a signed entry, a thumbprint, and a license number tied to one person. It's her, Ethan. I'm sorry. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories and better audio quality. Now back to the video. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a long time before I told my father anything. He was in the next room, learning how to use a smartphone I'd bought him that week, and I remember watching him through the doorway, this man relearning the smallest pieces of a life that had been taken from him, and thinking about how much bigger the theft actually was than either of us had understood 20 minutes earlier. When I finally told him, he didn't look surprised the way I expected. He looked tired, the specific tired of a man confirming something he'd half suspected, but never let himself say out loud. Karen used to visit me, he said quietly, early on, the first year or two. She stopped coming around the same time your mother stopped answering my letters. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You wrote letters? Every month, he said, for the first 3 years. I never got a single one back. Alvarez confirmed it 2 days later, once the facility released its full visitor and mail logs under the APS subpoena. My father had written 41 letters over 3 years, all addressed to our old house on Larkspur Avenue, all logged as sent through the facility's outgoing mail system. Not one had ever reached me. My mother had been intercepting his mail the entire time, the same year she staged his funeral, the same year she opened the account that would later hold 12 years of stolen combat pay. There was a strange, quiet relief in finally having a name attached to the second half of the mystery, even a name I loved, even a name I'd grown up calling Aunt Karen at Christmas dinners and birthday parties for as long as I could remember. It meant the lie wasn't some abstract system failure. It was 2 specific women, related to me by blood, who had sat across from me at family gatherings for over a decade, smiling, passing dishes, asking about my grades, while quietly managing the machinery of a lie neither of them had ever once shown a flicker of guilt about in front of me. Karen's role, once Alvarez laid it all out for me, was smaller than my mother's, but not innocent. She wasn't the architect, she was the tool. A licensed notary who worked out of a strip mall office 2 blocks from my mother's house, she had notarized the fraudulent power of attorney 11 months after my father's hospitalization, the same year the account had opened, without ever verifying that the man whose signature she was certifying was in the room, conscious or even aware the document existed. Bank records showed a $15,000 transfer from that account into Karen's personal checking account 4 months after the notarization, described in the memo line as a loan, never repaid. My mother hadn't just lied to me. She'd built an entire structure to make sure the lie held for 12 years, and she'd recruited her own sister to be the load-bearing wall of it. Alvarez said the confrontation needed to happen properly this time, on the record, with witnesses who weren't just family. He arranged a mediation meeting at his office, technically voluntary, though he made it clear to my mother's newly hired attorney that refusing would look very bad if this ever reached a courtroom. She agreed to come. Victor came with her. Karen came too, though I don't think she had much choice once her name showed up in a subpoena. The conference room had a long table and too much fluorescent light, the kind that makes everyone look a little bit guilty. My father sat beside me. Alvarez sat across from my mother's attorney, a sharp-looking man named Feldman who kept his expression carefully blank the entire time. Grace Whitfield from Adult Protective Services sat at the end of the table with a folder thick enough to double as a doorstop. My mother tried the soft voice first, the one she'd used in the voicemail. Ethan, sweetheart, I know how this all looks laid out on paper, but you have to understand I was a young widow with a 6-year-old. I panicked. I made a decision I regretted almost immediately, and then I didn't know how to undo it without losing everything, including you. You weren't a widow, I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Widows bury husbands. You hid one. There's a difference, and I think you've known the difference for 12 years. Her face flickered. flickered, just for a second, the mask slipping before she caught it. Victor stepped in the way he always did, redirecting instead of defending. "This is exactly the kind of dramatic thing you always did as a kid," he said, looking at me but talking to the room. "Everything's a crisis with you. We gave you a roof for 18 years and this is the thanks." My father spoke for the first time since sitting down, and his voice was quiet, but it filled the room in a way Victor's never had. "You gave him a roof," he said, "using money that belonged to me. Money meant to support him, while telling him I was dead. I don't need you to apologize to me, Victor. I need you to understand that I'm not confused and I'm not going anywhere, and neither is he." Karen hadn't said a word since sitting down. Grace turned to her directly. "Ms. Whitmore," she said, using Karen's professional notary name from the file, "can you walk us through the circumstances under which you notarized this power of attorney in March, 12 years ago?" Karen's composure cracked in a way her sister's hadn't. Her hands started shaking around the water bottle in front of her. "Diane told me it was just a formality," she said, voice thin. "She said Daniel had agreed to it before he was hospitalized, that it just needed to be finalized on paper. I didn't verify because she's my sister. I trusted her." "You received $15,000 from that account 4 months later," Grace said, not unkindly, just factually, and Karen didn't have an answer for that one at all. My mother's attorney tried to steer the conversation toward a settlement, framing it as a family matter that could be resolved privately, repayment structured over time, no need for anything to go further. Alvarez cut him off, calm and unhurried. "This isn't a civil dispute over an unpaid loan, counselor. Your client staged a funeral for a living man to access his federal disability and survivor benefits for 12 years, forged his signature on legal documents, and diverted funds belonging to a minor. Adult Protective Services is already involved. The VA's Office of Inspector General has been notified as of this morning. This isn't going away with a payment plan." My mother's face went white in a way I'd never seen. For the first time in that entire meeting, in that entire 12 years, she didn't have a redirect ready. She just sat there, and I watched something in her finally understand that the story was over, that there was no version of events left where she got to be the one telling it. I looked at her across the table, at the woman who had raised me and lied to me in the same breath for as long as I could remember, and I said the thing I'd been carrying since the shelter intake room. "I'm not doing this because I hate you," I said. "I'm doing this because you took 12 years from him and 18 years of the truth from me, and you did it so smoothly that I never even thought to ask the question. I needed a stranger in a plastic chair to ask it for me. That's what I can't get past, not the money. That you let me grieve a man who was alive, and you let it cost me 2 years of therapy for a death that never happened, and you never once, in 18 years, looked like it weighed on you at all." Nobody in the room said anything for a long time after that. Victor finally broke the silence, and what came out of him wasn't defense anymore. It was something closer to fear. "What happens now?" he said, quieter than I'd ever heard him. "Now," Alvarez said, "we let the investigations run their course, and you should probably both get your own attorneys separate from each other. Conflicts of interest are about to become the least of your problems." The weeks after the mediation moved faster than I expected, and then slower than I could stand, sometimes in the same afternoon. The VA's Office of Inspector General opened a formal fraud investigation within days, which meant federal agents, not just Grace and her folder, started requesting records going back to the year of the fake funeral. The county prosecutor's office picked up the forged power of attorney as a separate criminal matter. Karen was charged first, with fraud related to false notarization, and she took a plea deal within a month, cooperating fully in exchange for a reduced sentence. Part of her cooperation meant handing over an email thread between her and my mother from the year of the funeral, one Karen had apparently kept. Whether out of guilt or self-protection, I never found out. In it, my mother had written, in her own words, that Daniel being gone officially solves everything. The benefits, the house, all of it. Nobody has to know he's just sick, not dead. Reading that sentence in a printed exhibit was worse than anything Victor or my mother had said to my face. It wasn't panic. It wasn't a young widow making a desperate mistake. It was a plan, typed out in full sentences, with the punctuation of someone who had thought it through. My mother was charged with multiple counts: financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, forgery, wire fraud tied to the federal benefits, and filing a false death record with the county. Victor wasn't charged criminally since the money hadn't passed directly through accounts in his name, but he was named in the civil suit Alvarez filed on my father's behalf for unjust enrichment, given that his truck, his golf clubs, 2 of his vacations, and a portion of his daughter's wedding costs had all been paid for, at least in part, with funds traced back to my father's benefits. Family sides got chosen fast, and not always the way I expected. My grandmother, my mother's own mother, testified in a deposition about the funeral, confirming under oath that she'd never seen a body, never been given an explanation for the closed casket, and had simply trusted her daughter the way mothers do. She started calling me every Sunday after that. Small check-ins, nothing dramatic, just trying to rebuild something that had never really existed between us before. Because for the first 18 years of my life, my mother had been the only bridge between me and the rest of that side of the family, and she'd built the bridge crooked on purpose. Melissa, Victor's daughter, became an unexpected ally in a way that surprised both of us. She'd grown up resenting her father's remarriage almost almost as much as I resented Victor's arrival in my own life, and once she saw the documents, she stopped defending him entirely. She reached out to offer, of all things, the name of a therapist she'd used years earlier who specialized in family financial trauma. I took the number. I didn't call it for another 2 months, but I kept it in my wallet the whole time, like a promise to myself that I'd eventually be ready. Not everyone came around. My cousin Danielle stayed loyal to my mother through the whole thing, showing up to the arraignment, sending me a single message afterward that said simply, "I hope you're happy," as though justice were a hobby I'd taken up out of spite. I didn't respond. Some bridges, I was learning, weren't worth rebuilding, and it was strange to discover that I felt more relief than grief over that particular one. Victor made a few final desperate moves before it was all over. He tried, at one point, to get a restraining order against me and my father, claiming harassment, citing the confrontation at the house months earlier as evidence. The judge who reviewed it had already seen the video I'd recorded that day and dismissed the petition in under 5 minutes, noting on the record that the footage showed the opposite of what Victor was alleging. He also tried, through a mutual acquaintance, to reach out to my father directly, hoping, I think, to appeal to some old-fashioned sense of man-to-man reasonableness that might make the lawsuit go away quietly. My father didn't respond to the message. He forwarded it straight to Alvarez instead, without comment, and Alvarez used it as an example of continued contact in violation of the protective order, which only made things worse for Victor. There was a night, about 10 weeks into all of it, when my father sat across from me at his little kitchen table, the window unit rattling the same way it always did, and he asked me quietly whether I ever regretted digging as deep as I had, whether some part of me wished I'd just taken the money owed and walked away, let the rest of it stay buried. I told him no, but I also told him the truth, which was that some nights I missed the version of my mother I thought I'd had for 18 years, even knowing now that she never really existed. It's a strange kind of grief, mourning someone who's still alive, still sitting in a house 4 miles away, because the person you're actually grieving is a character she played convincingly enough that you built your whole childhood around trusting her. I cried harder over that than I had over almost anything else in the whole ordeal, sitting in my father's tiny kitchen with the window unit rattling, mourning a mother who had never actually existed the way I remembered her. My father reached across the table and put his hand over mine, the way I imagine he might have when I was small if he'd ever gotten the chance. "I lost 12 years, he said. You lost 18. We're allowed to grieve both of those things and still choose each other now. Those aren't opposites." There was a hearing, about 7 months into the process, that I still think about more than almost any other moment in the whole ordeal. My mother's attorney tried to get the wire fraud charge reduced by arguing that the funds, while mismanaged, had ultimately still gone toward raising the beneficiary, meaning me, and that no true theft had occurred since I had, after all, been housed and fed for 18 years. The prosecutor, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Delgado, stood up and read the actual numbers into the record. 12 years of combat pay and survivor benefits, totaling just over $138,000 deposited across that period. Of that, receipts and bank records could account for roughly $31,000 spent on anything resembling my direct care, groceries, school fees, the 2 years of grief therapy for a death that never happened. The rest, over $100,000, had gone to the mortgage on Larkspur Avenue, Victor's truck payments, 2 vacations to Sanibel Island and Cabo San Lucas, and the $15,000 payment to Karen. The defense wants the court to believe housing a child is the same as honoring what that money was actually for, Ms. Delgado said. It was never a housing stipend. It was disability and survivor compensation for a documented combat injury diverted for 12 years by someone who told everyone in her life, under oath at a funeral, that the man who earned it was dead. I sat in the gallery that day next to my father and watched my mother stare straight ahead at the defense table, jaw tight, refusing to look at either of us while the numbers were read out loud in a room full of strangers. It was the closest I ever saw her come in the entire proceeding to something that looked like shame instead of performance. It didn't last. By the time the hearing ended, she'd rearranged her face back into the careful, wounded expression she wore for every camera and every courtroom appearance after that. But for about 90 seconds, while Ms. Delgado read that number out loud, I watched my mother look, for the first time in my life, like someone who understood exactly what she had done. The sentencing hearing came almost a year to the day after the mediation in Alvarez's office. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Kowalski, asked before handing down the sentence whether the victim wanted to make a statement, and Alvarez had warned me weeks earlier that I might be given the chance. I stood up anyway, hands shaking, and read from 3 index cards I'd rewritten 4 separate times. "I'm not asking for the maximum sentence out of anger," I said. "I'm asking the court to understand that this wasn't a mistake made in a moment of panic. It was a plan, built and maintained for 12 years, that required my mother to lie to a 6-year-old at a funeral, intercept 41 letters from a hospitalized man begging to hear from his son, and recruit her own sister to forge his signature. Every year that plan held, my father lost another year he can't get back, and I lost another year believing a version of my life that was never true. I'm not asking the court to make that fair. I know it can't. I'm just asking the court to call it what it actually was. Judge Kowalski looked at my mother for a long moment before she spoke. Ms. Whitmore, she said, using my mother's name the same clinical way Grace had once used Karen's. In 22 years on this bench, I have seen financial exploitation cases involving strangers, caregivers, even spouses. I don't often see a parent construct a false death for a living spouse specifically to intercept a minor child's inheritance and benefits. The court takes some comfort in the restitution structure and the defendant's lack of prior record, but make no mistake, the harm here was not incidental. It was engineered. My mother received 3 years of probation, full restitution ordered, though everyone in that courtroom understood how unlikely full recovery actually was, and a permanent record that would follow her through every background check for the rest of her life. It wasn't the prison sentence some part of me had wanted in the angrier months of that year, but watching Judge Kowalski use the word engineered out loud in a public record gave me something I hadn't realized I still needed. Someone with actual authority. Someone who wasn't my father or Rosa or Alvarez or anyone already on my side, looking at the whole 12 years and calling it exactly what it was. The legal side dragged on with the particular slowness that only government processes seem to manage. It took another 5 months before the VA finalized my father's full benefit reinstatement, along with a partial back payment covering a portion of the years the funds had been misdirected, since a full recovery wasn't possible once the money had already been spent. The civil suit against Victor and my mother settled out of court 14 months after that meeting in Alvarez's office, for an amount that didn't come close to covering 12 years, but at least covered my father's transition into independent living and 2 years of my own delayed college tuition. My mother's criminal case ended in a plea agreement rather than a trial, 3 years probation, restitution, and a formal record that will follow her for the rest of her life, though notably no jail time, a detail that still sits uneasily with me some days. Karen served 4 months in county jail and lost her notary license permanently. I moved my father again during that stretch, out of the furnished apartment and into a small rental house with a real yard, using part of the civil settlement. He planted tomatoes his first spring there, the kind of small, ordinary thing a person does when they finally have a life quiet enough to plant something in. I helped him dig the beds on a Saturday in April, both of us on our knees in the dirt, not talking much, just working, and it was one of the first moments in that entire year that felt like healing instead of just processing. He named the tomato varieties after his old squad, small handwritten plant markers pushed into the soil, names I never got to hear stories about growing up because everyone I asked believed those stories had died with him overseas. That spring, kneeling in the dirt beside him, I finally got to hear a few of them, secondhand and imperfect, the way most family stories are, but real this time, told by the man who'd actually lived them instead of a version my mother had invented to explain his absence. I went back to see Rosa at the shelter that same spring, almost a year to the week after she'd first knelt beside my chair in that intake room. She remembered me instantly, which she told me later wasn't always the case, that she saw hundreds of people come through those doors every year, and most of their stories blurred together after a while. Mine hadn't. She hugged me at the front desk and asked carefully how my father was doing, and I told her about the tomatoes, and she laughed in a way that made the whole ugly year feel, for just a moment, like it might have been worth something after all. I brought her a card that day, nothing fancy, just a few sentences thanking her for asking the one question nobody else in my life had ever thought to ask. She kept it pinned to a corkboard behind the intake desk. I saw it there again months later, faded a little from the fluorescent light, still holding its place among dozens of other cards from dozens of other people whose lives she'd interrupted in exactly the right way. Reconnecting with my father meant relearning things about myself I hadn't realized I'd absorbed from Victor and my mother without noticing. I flinched for months whenever anyone raised their voice near me, even in excitement. I apologized reflexively for things that weren't my fault, a habit I traced back to years of being told I was a financial and emotional burden simply for existing in that house. My father noticed these things faster than I did, and he never made me feel small for having them. He just started narrating gently whenever he caught one happening. "You don't have to apologize for asking a question," he'd say, if I flinched after asking to borrow his car, or "You're allowed to want something without earning it first." If I hesitated over ordering food at a restaurant because some old voice in my head was still doing math about whether I deserved it. I started seeing a therapist that summer, using the number Melissa had given me months earlier, the one I'd carried around in my wallet like a promise. Her name was Dr. Osei, and in our third session, she said something that stuck with me for the rest of that year and every year after. "The version of your childhood you grieved at 6 years old was never real," she said, "but the grief was. Grief doesn't require the loss to be true. It only requires you to believe it fully at the time. You're allowed to have actually grieved something, even if it turns out the thing you were grieving was a lie someone told you." That sentence untangled something in me that I hadn't been able to name on my own. I hadn't just been lied to. I'd been made to perform an entire childhood of mourning for an event that never happened. And the performance had real costs, real therapy bills, real nightmares, real years of my life spent believing my father chose to die rather than come home to me. Understanding that difference between the lie and the grief it produced was the beginning of actually being able to put the whole thing down instead of carrying it everywhere I went. My mother reached out one more time, close to the end of her probation period, almost 2 years after the ice water and the duffel bags. She sent a letter, actual paper, to my father's house, since she still didn't have my current address and I'd made sure it stayed that way. In it, she apologized, sort of, in the careful language of someone who'd clearly had a lawyer review it first. Phrases like, "I recognize the harm my choices caused," standing in for anything resembling a real reckoning. She asked if there was any chance, someday, of rebuilding some kind of relationship, however small. I thought about it for 3 weeks before I answered. In the end, I wrote back a single page, and I kept a copy of it because I wanted to remember exactly what I'd said. I told her that I didn't hate her, that hate would have required more energy than I had left to give her. I told her that I understood intellectually that people make catastrophic decisions out of fear, and that fear doesn't excuse the decision, but it can at least explain the shape of it. And I told her that understanding wasn't the same as trusting, and that I wasn't interested in a relationship built on the same foundation that had already collapsed once, especially not with someone who still, in an entire signed apology letter, never used the word lie about anything she'd done. She hasn't written again since. I don't know if that means she respected the boundary or simply gave up, and at some point I stopped needing to know which one it was. Victor moved out of state within a year of the settlement to live near one of his daughters, not Melissa. I heard through Melissa, who I still talk to occasionally, that he tells a version of the story now where he was misled by my mother the whole time, an innocent bystander swept up in her scheme. Melissa doesn't believe it, and neither do I, given how many years he sat at that dinner table calling me a burden with the same casual certainty my mother used. But I've stopped needing him to admit anything either. Some people never get to the reckoning. You have to build your peace without waiting for them. I think about that a lot now, especially on the Sundays my grandmother calls or the afternoons my father waters his tomatoes and hums something tuneless under his breath, off-key in a way that used to embarrass me at 9 years old and now feels like the most reassuring sound I know. Peace, I've learned, doesn't arrive as a single verdict or a single apology. It arrives in installments the way the truth itself did. One document, one hearing, one small ordinary Sunday dinner at a time, until eventually you look up and realize you've built an entire life out of the pieces nobody thought you'd be able to use. I enrolled at Sinclair Community College that fall, part-time at first, since the settlement money covering tuition took months to actually clear, and I was working 2 jobs in the meantime to help cover rent on the small apartment I'd finally moved into, 3 blocks from my father's rental house, close enough to walk over for dinner most Sundays. I studied social work, which surprised exactly no one who knew the whole story, least of all Rosa, who wrote me a recommendation letter for a scholarship application without my even asking her to. "You already know how to ask the question nobody else thinks to ask," she wrote in that letter, and reading it later made me cry in a parking lot before an evening class. My grandmother came to my father's house for dinner that Thanksgiving, the first time the two of them had been in the same room in over 12 years. It was awkward at first, the kind of awkward that comes from two people trying to figure out how much of the missing time they're allowed to mourn out loud in front of each other. By the end of the night, she was helping him wash dishes at the sink, the two of them talking quietly about nothing important, and I sat at the table watching a version of family I hadn't known I was allowed to want. Melissa came to that dinner too, eventually, once we'd built enough trust between us that it didn't feel strange to invite her. She brought a pie from a bakery near her apartment and spent most of the night asking my father questions about his time in the service, genuinely curious in a way that had nothing to do with guilt or obligation. Watching her and my father laugh together at the same table where, months earlier, her own father had once called me a burden felt like proof that people aren't always sentenced to repeat the family they came from. There were still hard days, paperwork mistakes from the VA that took weeks to untangle, a court date that got rescheduled twice, dragging the whole ordeal back into my chest each time like a wound that hadn't fully closed. A birthday, my 19th, that I almost didn't want to celebrate at all because the last one had ended with ice water and a duffel bag, and some anniversaries take longer than a year to stop flinching at. My father noticed that flinch, too. He didn't say anything grand about it. He just showed up that morning with 2 coffees and a box of donuts and sat with me on my apartment steps until the day felt like mine again instead of something to survive. It's been almost 3 years now since that Tuesday morning on Larkspur Avenue, since the ice water and the duffel bags and a plastic chair in a shelter intake room that ended up rerouting the entire rest of my life. I finished my associate's degree last spring, and I'm 2 semesters into a bachelor's program now, still studying social work, still planning, eventually, to end up in a room like the one Rosa sat me down in, asking someone else the question nobody else thought to ask them. My father is doing well, genuinely well, not the careful, hedged kind of well people say about someone they're worried might fall apart if you look at them wrong. His tomato beds have expanded to take up most of the backyard now, and last summer he started teaching a woodworking class 2 afternoons a week at the VA's community center downtown, something he said he never would have have had the confidence to do even a year earlier. He still cries easily. I don't think that ever fully goes away after 12 years of not being allowed to feel much of anything. I've stopped seeing it as a wound and started seeing it as evidence that he came back to himself intact underneath everything, which is more than I think either of us expected the day I found him sitting by that window in a hallway that smelled like floor wax. My mother is still living on Larkspur Avenue, alone now, since Victor moved out of state not long after the settlement. I don't know much else about her life because I've kept the boundary I set in that letter 2 years ago, and it's held. Some days that feels like strength. Other days, if I'm honest, it still feels a little like grief wearing a strength costume. And I've learned those two things can occupy the same body at the same time without canceling each other out. I think about the version of that morning I used to imagine before I knew any of this. The version where my father died a hero overseas, and my mother simply never recovered from losing him. Where the coldness in that house was just unprocessed grief wearing a difficult face. I spent 18 years building sympathy for a story that never happened, forgiving things that didn't need forgiving because I thought they were symptoms of loss instead of choices made in service of a lie. There's a particular kind of anger that comes from realizing you spent that much of yourself defending someone who was never actually drowning, just protecting what she'd stolen. But I've also learned slowly that the anger doesn't have to be the last word in the story. My father says it best, most Sundays, sitting across from me at his kitchen table with the window unit finally replaced, no longer rattling, just humming quietly the way it's supposed to. He says that the 12 years he lost taught him that time stolen isn't the same as time destroyed. You can't get it back, but you can still build something real in whatever's left, and it counts just as much as the years that came easily. I believe him. I have to. It's the only version of this story that lets me keep going. Sometimes people ask me, when they hear pieces of this story secondhand, whether I regret pushing as hard as I did, whether some quieter version of me could have taken the settlement and disappeared into a normal life without dragging a courtroom and a prosecutor and a judge into what was, underneath all the legal language, still a family falling apart in public. I understand the question. There were nights that year I asked it of myself, usually around 2 in the morning, staring at a motel ceiling, or later at my own apartment ceiling, wondering if I was chasing justice or just chasing the version of the story where I finally got to be believed. I don't think those two things were ever actually separate. I think for 12 years, I was the only person in that house who didn't know the real shape of what was happening around me. And once I did know, staying quiet would have meant agreeing, one more time, to be the last person in the room to understand my own life. I wasn't willing to do that again. Not for $35,000. Not for the family peace everyone kept asking me to protect. Not for anything. My father says the tomatoes taste better every summer, though I suspect that has less to do with the soil and more to do with the fact that he's finally the one deciding what grows in it. The morning my parents woke me with ice-cold water and threw me out on my 18th birthday, I thought it was the worst thing that had ever happened to me. For a long time, I thought it was the moment that broke my life in half. Now I understand it differently. That morning didn't break anything that wasn't already broken and hidden underneath a funeral that never happened. It just finally let the light in. It cost me almost everything I thought I knew about my own family, and it cost my father 12 years he'll never get back. But it also gave me the truth and gave him his life. And some mornings, sitting in his kitchen while he waters the tomatoes through the window, I think that trade, as brutal as it was, might have been the only honest thing either of us was ever given. I still don't celebrate my birthday the way most people do. I don't think I ever fully will again. But every year on that same Tuesday date, my father makes coffee, and we sit on the back steps together, and we don't say much of anything at all. We don't have to. Some silences are just two people who finally get to be exactly who they are, sitting quietly in the truth, no longer buried, no longer alive for 12 years in a story that was never theirs to tell.